Good morning. Continuing our review and summary of the conclusion of Hemshech Ayin Beis. We are on volume 3 of Ayin Beis, page 1464. By the new paragraph. So to sum up what we've learned, the Rebbe Rashab has now returned back to the central theme of Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam. Why it's called a Ner? Because the psila, the wick of the divine soul, inserted, like the divine soul, inserted in the shemen, in the wisdom, intelligence of the animal soul, because the neshama, the nefesh halikis, is mislabish, manifests within the body and the animal soul, with the goal of transforming the animal soul to also love Hashem into the Eir, the flame, the Ner Hashem, which is V'haftas Hashem Elokecha, through the Hizbonus of Shema Yisrael, which we're going to discuss later. So what we've so far laid out is, first, the whole case was made, how the shemen indicates on intelligence of the animal soul, and that we discussed on the previous page. And then the last section, the discussion of the difference between Chachma of Nefesh Halikis and the Chachma of the Nefesh Habamis, where the Nefesh Habamis, like the very animal that walks on all four, which means became a kfufa, bent over. So the midas are the primary force, even though there's seichel, but the seichel is all around self-interest, self-preservation, and existence. Whereas the human being walks upright with the seichel, has the ability to control the emotional impulses. And he explained with the nefesh habamis, it's a more refined and higher level than it is in the animal, actual animal. But still, it's still, as he said, that the seichel has ikri binyanim gashmim, that the primary seichel and das of a nefesh habamis is in order to help take care of its own needs. He said either the needs of the body, the things that he desires, like for instance, to conceive of different ways to make money and become and acquire wealth, or honor and glory, or to protect your reputation, to represent your own interests and merits. This is all seichel that's connected to the midas, meaning to the subjective interests of the person. And even in seichel and chachma, that's not connected to midas, like intelligence, like he said, like science, or astronomy, or medicine. Those are the three examples he gave. Even there, and like all the deep ideas and concepts in the chachmas chitzenis, the secular wisdom, nevertheless, it's all about the akshama, understanding the yesh, the very existence of something, dissecting the yesh of it, not the ruchnius, not the divine energy within it, what brought it into being, not the ayin aliki, but the yesh. Whereas the seichel aliki of the nefesh alikis is in stark contrast to that diametric opposite. Its interest is to understand the ruchnius, how the ayin aliki creates the ayin aliki that creates this yesh. What is going on? How and what is making it tick on a spiritual level, and how it came into being from the ayin and the manner that it came into being, and also the wonder of this very creation from ayin to yesh, and how the entire existence is completely nullified, the yesh to the ayin. But the seichel of nefesh habamis is b'akshama b'yeshes, because it's connected to the ruach habehema, which is connected to midas and to the nature of existence. And the root, that's the chachma within Zah, like we learned, that the shvira, the shattering of the containers, was in the midas, das and below, and that where there's chachma there too. But that's already chachma of neiga, that's connected already to existence. Whereas the chachma of the nefesh halikis is connected, it's a chachma that's higher than the shvira, because it's all about the divine elikus, the ayin, not the yesh. That's a summary of what we've learned. And now he's going to go into, okay, so what's the process? Fine. Now we have the nefesh halikis, nefesh habamis. They're basically pitted against each other. like he explains at length in Tanya. It's like a battle. So what's the next step? So we'll start the next paragraph on page 1464. And the pages that, if you want to follow the text, you can find them at ayinbeis.com. He says like this, Valkain. And therefore, when you're dealing with the avodah, the nefesh alikis, levada l'sakenas hanefesh habamis. Now when it comes to the avodah, the work, the effort of the divine soul to refine. Levada really means to separate, to clarify, and to refine and repair the animal soul, because you want it to go to be elevated. It shouldn't just remain an animalistic in the sense that it's all about its own self-interest or about the yesh. So how do you go about doing that? Especially since the midas of the nefesh habamis are very intense and they're very much driven and gravitate toward the yeshus of physical world. He says, tzarich liyas hatikun b'bechinas haseichel the nefesh habamis. You have to get access, you have to be able to create tikkun to the seichel of the nefesh habamis. Because that's where the seichel, that's where its intelligence is directed. You want to redirect it, so you have to go to the seichel. As we discussed, the midas are harder to attack because the midas are the very impulses themselves. It's the seichel that you can speak to. It's like when a person is very much in the throes of a passion, you want to say to them, you can't even speak to them because they're so emotional about it and so subjective. You want to say, let's calm down and let's talk to each other. That means you're trying to access the seichel. So in this case, it's the seichel of the nefesh habamis that we want to be able to speak to. That's the tikkun b'chinas seichel the nefesh habamis. As I mentioned, that Tzemach Tzedek writes that the midas is where the shvira happens, is much harder to speak to. But seichel, which even though the seichel of the nefesh habamis is also in Zohar where there was a shvira, but the seichel is not quite as much impacted. Like we learned earlier, that the seichel, b'chlal chochmah and bin is higher than the shvira, but even the seichel in the nefesh habamis, the chochmah is obviously not as quite as intense as the midas themselves are. So for example, when a person is very hungry, if you speak to the midas only want one thing, they need to eat. The seichel can be maybe convinced, maybe now is not the time where we have to discipline ourselves, etc. So that's the point here. So the tikkun is in the seichel of nefesh habamis, which is which is, as we said, initially driven by the yesh, and you want the nefesh halikis to impact it. V'hainu. So how do we do that? How do you take human intelligence, which is driven by either emotional needs, like he said, the need to either in parnasa, in livelihood, to be successful in business, and you're using your mind. A person is using their mind to build a successful business, like he said, to gain innovative ways to gain wealth, acquire wealth, or honor and glory, or like he said, to preserve or to protect or their reputation or represent their need, their merits. And even the seichel of science, like he said, the seichel of nature or astronomy and medicine is all about the yesh. How do you change that? So in actual behema, physical behema, you can't, because there it's hardwired. But in a seichel of nefesh habamis, you could. Because even though initially that's its nature, but because it's seichel, you can speak to it. And that's what he's going to say. What is the process of starting to refine, basically in very simple terms? How do you, most people, we've talked about this on a very practical level, are busy with their own needs. Even if they have some altruism and even transcendence, it's still primarily they live their lives around themselves. I'm not even speaking if you're an arrogant person or even something inappropriate. It's just about self-interest. So how do you take a nefesh habamis and do something with that? How do you take the seichel of the nefesh habamis? Person is immersed. Where are they putting most of their energy? Into their business. Can you do anything with that? So he says, yeah. V'hainu, the beizbonus the nefesh halikis, through the contemplation of the nefesh halikis, because the nefesh halikis resides and is engaged with. Remember, it doesn't remain removed. It enters into the body and the animal soul. So they speak to each other. Like think of Yaakov and Esav they're both in their mother's womb, and they happen to be twins. So in this context, the Nefesh Elikis and the Nefesh Habamis can speak to each other. So he starts like this. So the first thing is Nefesh Elikis has to prepare. It's like a teacher and a student. How do you teach a student who is completely undisciplined and untamed? You have to engage with it. So the first thing is the teacher, in this case, the Nefesh Elikis, has to have a izbanus, a contemplation, ba'asagosa, with its comprehension. But izbanus in hasagosa, in the comprehending. B'gdulas Erein Sof Baruch Hu, in the greatness of Erein Sof Baruch Hu. So that's how you start introducing it. We didn't get yet to Nefesh Habamis. But the first thing, Nefesh Elikis can't just remain quiet and dormant, or else it won't have any effect. So when a Nefesh Elikis begins to contemplate on the greatness of Ein Sof Baruch, Gdulas Ein Sof Baruch Hu, Ukahai Gavna, and similar different type of contemplations. The Gdulas Ein Sof, you could talk about the Ayin and the Yesh. I mean, there's different things that the Nefesh Elikis can contemplate on. Yovei Gam B'Seichel Ativ the Nefesh Habamis. That will bring that idea, that concept, that contemplation will also arrive, will also be transmitted into the natural seichel of the animal soul. Shegam hu yovin es ha'inyan eliki. That the seichel of the nefesh habamis will also understand this divine concept. Because remember, the nefesh habamis is an intelligent entity. It's just its focus is on the yesh, on the midas, on the subjective needs. But it doesn't mean the Seichel Nefesh Habamis cannot understand. Just like it can understand science, even though science is about the yes, why can it not understand Ruchnius? But the Nefesh Elikis is the one that has to introduce it. It won't happen on its own. But still, they are still diametric opposites. So how do we contend with that? So he said, Da'agam the Nefesh Elikis with Nefesh Habamis. And though, as we learned, the divine soul and the animal soul, He mahavchim zemezeh, they're opposites from one another. He said those words exactly. One focuses on the yesh and the midas. One focuses on the ayin eliki. Betachlis should add them. Unequivocally, they're opposites from each other. Not just also opposites. They're completely two different directions. One focuses on the yesh, like we learned. One focuses on the ayin. Hein b'haseichel v'hasoga shelahem. And this opposite qualities, he's now going to elaborate more, is both in their seichel, in their intelligence and comprehension of the seichel the nefesh elikis be'etzem, the intelligence of the divine soul, fundamentally, at its core, essentially, hurak binyani elikus, it's only in divine matters. Ve'eina mesugel klali ideas v'hasogas acheres. Not only is it not interested, not only is it not involved, engaged with other things, it's not even mesugel. Nefesh Elikis is a divine thing. All it cares about is elikus. So any ideas, v'hasogas acheres, any other knowledge or comprehensions or understanding, it's not even a keli. It's not mesugel. It's not even appropriate. It's not even fitting. It's not in its domain. On the other hand, the seichel nefesh habamis, v'aseichel nefesh habamis, hu rak b'tzarchei atzmei. He's saying rak means exclusively. It's only in its own needs. Hachumdim, its own crass, material, mundane needs. V'haskola rak b'yeshus hadover. And its understanding is only in the yeshus, like we said. Even the things that are not its needs, like scientific understand and scientific wisdom, is only in the yeshus hadover canal. Like we said before, it's in the yeshus. It's an understanding, dissecting and understanding what matter is made of, which is just the essence of that type of wisdom. So that's the seichel of diametric opposites. For kolshkein, ba'amidis. And for sure the midas, the emotional impulses of the nefesh habamis, nefesh elikis are diametric opposites. Shein rechekim uvdolim zem zeh betachlis. They're distant and separate to the farthest extreme. Like literally two ends of the spectrum. Because the divine soul, its entire desire and will, and all its emotional impulses, are only directed to godliness, la'ava, es Hashem, to love God, uliyira eisei, and to revere Him, ulafayir ulahides, and to glorify Him or exalt Him, ulahides, and acknowledge Him. You see, these are the midas. The midas are, he said here, chesed is ava, gvura is yira, lafayir is tiferes, and lahides is hoid. He doesn't mention the others, but when we say L'cha Hashem Agdula Gvura Tiferes VaNetzach VaHeid, so he mentions four now, the four of the midas. Again, Ave V'Yira, Tiferes, and Hoid. That's the reason for that is not, it's not because he doesn't want to talk about Netzach. These are the easiest to just describe. That's the Nefesh Halakis, that's the midas. So not only the Seichel, but even more so, the midas are two opposites. V'amidas the nefesh habamis, by contrast, hemegashmim v'chumnim. They're physical and crass or coarse. Shenimshek rak acher hachumnius kebehemegashmis, which are drawn only to chumnius, mundane or crass, like a physical animal that's only interested in its own needs, which are like to eat, to breed, to protect its own, basically its own existential experience. So you see here two opposites, both in the Seichel and even more so in the Midas. Midas, and here he brings Taka the pasuk from Kehelis, Ruach ha'adam ha'ela hu l'mayla. The Ruach ha'adam, which is referring to the Nefesh Halakis, the spirit of the Adam, is what goes, what direction does it go? It's transcendent. It goes upward into Ruchnius. Liskasher uladovka b'mashal l'mayla manu, to bind itself and to connect and to cleave to that which is higher than itself. V'ruach ha'behema hayoredes lamata, whereas the spirit of the animal is the opposite direction. It goes downward into the physical, to the yesh. Like we said, physically, a human being looks up to heaven. An animal looks down to the ground, which also reflects its psychological personality. So based on that, going back, he said, so you said that the nefesh of the hasbonus of the nefesh halakis can impact the nefesh habamis, but they're opposites. In their seichel, they're opposite in their interests, in their intellectual interests, and even more so in their midas. U'makol mokem, here comes now the rejoinder, where the Rebbe Rashab goes back, that even though the Agam, the Nefesh Halakis Agam, Hemahofkim, going back to the third line of this paragraph, he's now, the end of this statement is, U'makol mokem, nevertheless, harihem mischabrim u'misachdim. They don't remain two separate worlds. They are, yes, fundamentally on their own, they're two separate entities that have no common denominator. But something happens. The Eibishter takes the Nefesh Halakis, al korcha chatachai, and he compels it to enter into the body and the animal soul. Mischabrim, they join. U'misachdim, and they unite. Zeim zeh, with each other. Achem k'muhus echad mamish, to the point they become like one muhus, like one personality. He'll soon say that this is only God's power to do such a thing. He literally takes two forces, two entities, two forces, two voices, two souls, Nefesh Halakis, Nefesh Habamis, which in both Seichel and Midas, they're two different directions, literally diametric opposites, joins them together, they become one muhus. When you look at a person, even though we know there's two nefashas, you don't see yourself as two people. You're one person. When you sit down to eat a meal, or you're learning right now Ayin Beis, who's engaged in that? Is it only the Nefesh Halakis, only the Nefesh Habamis? They're both joined together. Question is, who's in control? That, as he explains in Tanya, and we're going to learn here as well, that's the whole Aveda here, figuring out who should be in control. But they're definitely together in the sense that they're working together. One cannot eliminate the other. The Nefesh Habamis cannot expel the Nefesh Halakis. Nefesh Halakis cannot expel the Nefesh Habamis. In chapter 9 in Tanya, the Alter Rebbe puts it like a battle between two kings who are engaged in battle. And one day, Zeh comes, Zeh Neifel. This one can win today, the other one can win tomorrow, or even 1 minute to the next. Your Nefesh Halakis could be dominating, and then the Nefesh Habamis can dominate, because they are literally engaged to the point, like he calls them, Kimuhus Echad Mamish. And just for the record, this section is again the Mittler Rebbe's language, 368. On page 368 in the Maimer, in the Maimori Admur, I'm sorry, Bereshis Chanukah Maimer, which we learned, which is, I believe, also posted on ayinbeis.com. So the question now is, how is it possible that these two things come together? They're such opposites. We didn't discuss yet how the Nefesh Elokis impacts the Nefesh Habahamis, but he's again developing the case to explain, firstly, that they are, even though they're opposites, they're brought together. And how is that possible? So he says, "V'zehu miniflois Hashem." This is from the wonders of God. Shemekasher u'mechaber dover b'ifuchei mamish. He has the power to bind together and join together two total paradoxes, two opposites, mamish. That's the power of God. On its own, it would not be possible. It's like bringing fire and water together. And how is this joining together to the point we don't say we have 20 koiches, even though in Tanya explains Zel Umazeh, that Nefesh Elokis has 10 faculties and the Nefesh Habahamis has 10 faculties. But once they join together, it's 10 faculties, not 20. Question is who dominates, but it's still. And he says, Shekol koyach v'koyach proti the Nefesh Elokis. Every specific faculty of the Nefesh Elokis, Chochmah, Bina, Das, Chesed, Gvura, Tferes, Netzach, Yesed, Malchus, mislabish, manifests, gets enclosed, or misached, and becomes one, b'chol keach v'keach proti the Nefesh Habahamis, with every specific faculty of the Nefesh Habahamis. So yes, indeed, separately, Nefesh Elokis says 10 faculties, Nefesh Habahamis says 10, but these 10 enter, just like when you put on a garment. The garment is now your garment. He doesn't use the word garment, but he says mislabish. They become one. So when you look at the chachma of the person, right now, your wisdom, is it the wisdom of the divine soul? Is it the wisdom of the nefesh habam, of the animal soul? They join together, and they both engage. Again, you could have learning Torah, so the chachma of the nefesh Elokis is also influencing the nefesh habamis. If you're using your chachma for something that's your own needs, then the chachma of the nefesh Elokis is so-called being held hostage and trapped in something that it has no interest in, which is possible because that's the whole point of the neshama beguf. The divine soul is manifest inside the animal soul. Ukomei b'seichel, harima sheyaskil ha'odem b'seichel eliki, and he begins with the koiches seichel and midas. He says like seichel, intelligence. What a person conceives of with seichel eliki, divine intelligence, b'koyach ha'chochm the nefesh Elokis, with the power of chachma, with the faculty of chachma of the divine soul, it doesn't remain exclusively in the domain of nefesh Elokis, because the nefesh Elokis and nefesh habamis have joined together. You know, think of it like a very, very childish example. You have two people. One has an office here, one has another office there. One studies Torah all day, the other one is busy with business issues all day. So he's on the phone, he has meetings about business. The other one, everything that he's doing is involved in Torah. But then someone says, no more two offices. You don't have to sit in the same room together. This is obviously even deeper when a neshama beguf, nefesh Elokis, nefesh habamis. But I'm just using a simple example. Now, they hear each other. The one that's learning Torah, when he's learning out loud, the other person is listening. Obviously, he can ignore it and so on. But we're talking about that now he's in the same room with him. So the nefesh habamis is hearing what the nefesh Elokis is doing. So if the seichel of the nefesh Elokis is involved in seichel eliki, so it's mislabish b'seichel the nefesh habamis. Obviously, my example is very limited because you could say they sit in the same room and the second one isn't listening. When it comes to the nefesh Elokis, nefesh habamis, they become one, literally like one. Like he said, Mahus Echad Mamish. So it's mislabish b'seichel ativ the nefesh habamis. And therefore, the nefesh habamis is hearing and also can understand what the nefesh Elokis is saying. Now, obviously, this is going to take work, and we learned at length that's not so simple. You have to get the nefesh habamis' attention. We have the birchas yetzer of the before Shema, that is the malachim that help warm up the nefesh habamis. But the bottom line is you've gotten him into the room. It's like the first step has happened. Like in mediation, if they're not sitting, the two parties are not sitting near each other, you're not getting anywhere. At some point, you need to get them together. They may still disagree. And in this case, Nefesh Habamis does not agree with the Nefesh Elokis because it has his own interests. But at least you've got them into the same entity. That's the Neflois Hashem. That's what Hashem did. He said, I'll put them together. Now your job, meaning the person's job, is to take the Nefesh Elokis' seichel and begin contemplating. And that contemplation will carry over into the Nefesh Habamis. We aren't there yet. He didn't discuss the details of that, but that's the process here. So even though they're opposites, they've been brought together with the kavanah of the Nefesh Elokis influencing the Nefesh Habamis. But before I continue, let me stop just in case anyone wants to clarify anything. I think it's pretty straightforward, not very complicated, especially when you just think of yourself. You just use yourself as an example. All this plays itself out every minute of our lives. But he's giving us the dynamics of it, all the so-called ingredients. Let me stop here before the parentheses.
They are really not opposites. Both are seichel. They are opposite in the direction of the seichel, but they are common in seichel. So Memela, the seichel of Nefesh Elokis, if it's successful to convince the Nefesh Habamis, I think that's a perish.
That's the point. That's why there's some hope, because the Seichel Nefesh Habamis has Seichel. You can talk. If the Nefesh Habamis didn't have Seichel, it'd be a far, far harder avodah, if possible at all, because then you're dealing just pure midas. It's like talking to a child, a baby, that's crying. Try to convince the baby to stop crying with Seichel. The Seichel isn't active yet. But as soon as the Seichel becomes more active, even though it's like you said, driven by a hofchizdik, completely the other direction than Elokus into the Yesh. But yes, that's the whole point here. That seichel you can speak to, and that's where the work, that's the focus. Yeah. That's also part of why he explained at length how the shemen, the chachma, evolves from chachma of kedusha, then the shviras hakelim, till it becomes chachma of nega. So the chachma originates in the highest levels, but then because of the shvira, the shattering, the concealments, and so on, the chachma comes into nega, the shemen that's there in the nefesh habamis. But it could be extracted. That's why he said, for example, earlier about the zayis, that even though zayis is klippus nega, but through aveda you could transform it. Like he brought from the Mishnah's Chassidim, and before that about the shemen zayis, the machziri b'ayin shana, limud shel ayin shana. That's all examples of actually taking something and drawing. So in other words, even in klippus nega, there's a nitzur seleki. That's the whole point. However, it's now been downgraded, so to speak. It's now in the levush, in the garment of the klippa of the shell, and we want to draw it extracted. Same thing here with the chachma of the nefesh habamis. Okay. Are there any other questions or comments? So let's just continue. Well,
what does it mean? This is Bechlal and also here, that the nefesh elikis is mislabish benefesh habamis. The way that the nefesh elikis is mislabish beguf, it's going through the nefesh habamis.
I didn't say through. It just means they join together as one. Like I said, here's a nefesh elikis. Here's a nefesh habamis, and the Eibishter with his neflois is able to turn them into like one entity.
But the
word is islapshus, not maivir. It's not passing through. It becomes very much engaged. It's like a Rav and a Talmud. You know, the Rav and Talmud become biskashus mamish, where they're right now engaged with each other in the fullest sense of the word, to the point they become like one. A Rav and Talmud don't become mamish one, but like, for example, Maglin Talmud, Maglin Rabbi Imei, because there's a certain profound iskashus. But I mean, what does it mean when a koyach b'chlal mislabish in a aver? Take koyach haseichel. There's the difference between a live person and, God forbid, a corpse. One is just the kelim, ki ishtara ki gufa b'lei nishmasa. You put a neshama into a human being, so now seichel has entered into your brain. Koyach hariyah in your eye. So what does that mean in slapshus? Koyach is a spiritual faculty. It doesn't have any tangible entity. It's not a tangible entity, but it's like a oir. Think of like an energy, like electricity inside of a light bulb. Can you distinguish once it's in the light bulb and the light is shining? Can you tell me which part is electricity, which part is the light bulb? Obviously, the electricity is the energy within it, but they become one. The light is now shining. That's called islapshus. Obviously, neshama beguf is even deeper than electricity and appliance, but it's the same idea. Now, if the electricity remains outside of the appliance, or it starts flickering, or it's overwhelming a surge, then the circuits blow. Then, of course, it's not islapshus. Real islapshus is when one entity, energy, oir and keli are two opposites, and the oir is mislabish in the keli, the oir hariyah in the klei ha'ayin, the oir hashmiya in the klei ha'ezen, in the ear, and the same thing. So the same idea in nefesh elikis and nefesh abamis.
If that means that the nefesh elikis cannot be mislabish in guf without the nefesh abamis?
I don't know what that means. I'm not sure what you mean by that. What is that? It's just a theoretical question.
No, I'm asking you. It's like the example
it's
that you
called
gave.
islapshus. The way the language of Chassidus, islapshus nefesh elikis beguf and nefesh abamis. The guf is the very body. The nefesh abamis is the animal soul within that. What's the contradiction?
The nefesh abamis is like the tool that the nefesh elikis could be connected to the guf.
I don't know. I wouldn't choose. I've not seen it explained like that necessarily. I don't know about that.
So according to what you said, they have direct connection to the guf. Both.
The guf is the very physical body. A guf without a nefesh abamis, without a nefesh elikis, is just a corpse. It's just an inanimate keli. So you could go like this: the nefesh abamis is part of the life of the guf, but it's the nefesh abamis part. Nefesh elikis is the divine soul within. To me, the guf is the general keli, which has two nefashos within it, and these two nefashos are mislabish one with the other. I don't know if you. I have to think about whether the nefesh elikis has to go into nefesh abamis first before it goes into an animal in a body. Lav dafke v'haraya, 9 months in pregnancy, the nefesh elikis is beginning to enter, and there's no real nefesh abamis at work, and no nefesh elikis frankly at work. It's really just a nefesh and a body. So when the child is born, even though it says the nefesh elikis comes in at bar mitzvah, but the beginnings begin at the birth or at the bris, etc. So I think it's just a matter of stages of how it enters. But essentially, the guf is the keli, the nefesh in general is the oir. In the nefesh, there's two levels: nefesh elikis and nefesh abamis. That's how I would frame it.
Nefesh abamis is having two parts: the bahamis, and it's having the chayes of the guf. Nefesh.
I don't know. This is already outside of the realm of what we're learning here. I don't know if that's exactly the way one would put it. You have to go look in the Maimorim that talk about this. It's not here. They discuss this idea, what's the nefesh abamis and the guf relationship. Not addressing that here.
Rabbi, just one of the last things you said was actually pretty interesting. So you said the guf is the keli, and both nefashot elokis and habamas are the or. The or we talked about, that is the tzitzos of the from Shveres Kelim, that those sparks that fell are noga. They're not kedusha. So how I guess it's still or, but I guess it's a spark, so I guess it's still or. But I would have almost thought that the nefesh abamis is part of the goof, but I know the goof is just the inanimate vessel. But do you understand the question?
Like you just say, the nefesh abamis is rooted in those sparks of the shattered containers. What's the problem with that?
No problem at all. When I think of klipa, though, I guess I think of part of the keli. not the or.
No, there's we learned before. There's the Rapachnitzutzis. He said even the Mokamacher in the third line of page 1464. He said Rapachnitzutzis him b'chinas ha'er shenisha b'shivri hakelim. So there's this. You asked the question then, if you remember. There's the containers themselves that also have life, and then there's the sparks that were in those containers. Like I said, example Baruch, Beis Reish Vav Chaf. You tear them apart. The Beis has some form of spark in it, not just the letter Beis.
Right.
The same thing with the Reish. So the Nefesh Elokis, on the other hand, is not affected by the Shvira. It retains its divine nature.
So I understand, but that wasn't my question.
Bina higher than the Shvira.
That wasn't my question. I'm talking about Nefesh Abamis. It's still or. It's not Keli.
Let's not be semantics. Nefesh Abamis is a nefesh. It's a living entity. Even in an animal is not a corpse. An animal has a body and it has a life. The life of the animal, however, is driven by behemedic things, materialism or self-interest, or, like he said, the yesh. So by definition, nefesh habamis is a nefesh. It's not, and then there's the guf itself. The guf and nefesh habamis are not synonymous. The guf is the physical body. The nefesh habamis is the spirit. The physical, you can say the behemedic spirit within the.
Like a vivifying force.
Well, so is the divine soul a vivifying. Yeah. Everything's a vivifying force, but
I chop it.
Anyway, I'm not sure what.
No. Your answer was helpful. Thank you.
Okay, good. Okay, so continue here, the parentheses. So he says, so the Chacham of the Nefesh Elokis has a mislabish b'seichel the ativi the Nefesh Habamis, u'lechein be'emes ein ha'asog the Nefesh Elokis b'lekus lamata k'moishu asagos lamayla. So now he adds a very key point here. That's why Taka, if the Nefesh Elokis was not mislabish and Nefesh Habamis, then it should be exactly the way the Nefesh Elokis is in its root, in its purest form. But we know that's not the case. The asog of elikus of a nefesh elokis down below is not the same level as the asog of lamayla, where a nefesh elokis doesn't have a body and doesn't have an animal soul to deal with. A neshama alone in Gan Eden has a much deeper asog in elikus. Yes, it doesn't have the asog of atzmus ein areich like we learned and so on, but it does have a deeper level of asog. U'k'moishin is barely il b'kama duchtin, like it was discussed, explained earlier in a number of discourses, a number of places. So that tells you that Nefesh Elokis, when it comes down, it also goes through a Yerida, because it's it's manifesting, it's engaging. It would be like a teacher who has to teach kindergarten children, for example. So even though he may be brilliant, but when he's teaching his kindergarten children, that's where he's at. He's not the way he is with his teachers or with his colleagues in a different place. He's now engaging with the Nefesh Habamis. U'makol mokim, and nevertheless, it still remains a Nefesh Elokis. This doesn't mean, God forbid, that he becomes a Nefesh Habamis. It just means that now he's engaging with it. Makol mokim hari masig elikus. Nevertheless, Nefesh Elokis still comprehends godliness and still is only interested in godliness. It's just not on the same level as it is above. Gam binyonim ha'mukim v'gvoyim, and not just understanding godliness on a low level, also in deep and high sublime levels, ube'emek ve'erech ve'rechev, with depth and length and breadth. The three things, emek, rechev, and emek, is when you look at any three-dimensional object, you have the three. You have the length, the width, and the depth. So in Seichel also, the Mittler Rebbe explains it at length in Shar Yichud, in the Sefer Shar Yichud, that Seichel. So bottom line is, so though it's not the level of Asog as it is Lamaila, but coming down below, it still doesn't negate what he said before. It's still exclusively interested in godliness, and not just godliness, on the deepest levels possible. V'akolhu bo b'seichel hativi. And all that, this is critical, because on one hand, Nefesh Elokis has come down into Nefesh Habamis, but it retains its completely divine nature and wants to understand it to the farthest extent it can. And all that, because it's mislabish in the Nefesh Habamis, comes down on top of page 1465, b'seichel hativi. So this adds a little more depth can say dimension, to the discussion here. That's not just Nefesh Elokis is engaging with Nefesh Habamis, and that's that. It's bringing its entire divine understanding as best as it can down below, that too will carry over and spill over or affect the animal soul, Seichel HaTivi. Now, why does he call it sometimes Seichel HaTivi, sometimes Seichel HaNefesh Habamis? I already explained this a number of times. It's just different subtly. There's little different levels. Nefesh Habamis, sometimes it says Seichel HaNushi, Seichel HaTivi, sometimes Seichel Ha, there's also, okay, those two. And then the Seichel Nefesh Habamis. For all practical purposes, it's all synonymous here. It's just in this case, he's saying Seichel HaTivi, the Nefesh Habamis, like he said right before the parentheses.
Because
So
here,
like
Seichel
it's
HaTivi is
it's
Meduyak.
levels of understanding.
I
Excuse
think
me?
here is Meduyak, Seichel HaTivi, because the Nefesh Elokis is not mislabish in the Bahami. It's mislabish in the Seichel. It's part of the
Yeah,
Nefesh
but then how do you explain the three lines from the bottom of last page? Read that. You have the sefer.
Yeah,
The slabish b'seichel hativi de nefesh habamis.
yeah. Because we're
So he
talking
says
here,
clearly nefesh habamis.
of course, Nefesh Habamis.
So why
But we're
doesn't he say
talking,
here b'seichel hativi de nefesh habamis? You're telling me it's a diuk. He doesn't mean of nefesh habamis.
no. Of course, he means the part of the TV, not the part of the behemoth that is in Nefesh Habamis.
Fine, but he did say b'seichel hativi de nefesh habamis. Just trying to
Because
explain that it's pretty much synonymous here. Fine.
he doesn't have to say it again because he said already
Okay.
before. I
That's
think.
not a question. I just wanted to point out that it's not. That it's essentially the same idea. Yeah, it's fine to say what you're saying, Seichel TV, and then there's the behemoth part of it. I got it.
Because he said the Midas cannot contain it. Only the Seichel could convince a Seichel. Seichel HaTivi of the Nefesh Habamis.
Good. That's good. Fine. I agree. And now he continues. Ubekama mishalim v'dimyenis. And now he's saying, and this is slapshus in the seichel of the TV of the Nefesh Habamis, when the Nefesh Elokis is understanding a divine concept, it can come down also in Kama Mishalim in a number of examples, the dibyenis and comparisons. Ma'asogas hadvorim hativim b'chumrim. In other words, you can explain a divine idea with a number of examples and comparisons and parallels from things that are understandable of dvarim tivim. You could take, for example, take a scientific concept, an atom, or the properties of fire or water, the dvarim tivim v'chumrim, that the Nefesh Habamis absolutely understands, because like we said before, the Seichel of Nefesh Habamis understands nature and science and so on. But it can become a moshel and a dimion, an example or a parallel, a comparison for something of a divine concept. He's just explaining what does it mean. It's not just Nefesh mislabish Nefesh Habamis. It actually can become engaged with Nefesh Habamis with examples that Nefesh Habamis fully understands and is actually intrigued by. What you're adding, that the Nefesh Elokis is adding, is saying this idea that you're intrigued by. Let's say the study of the properties of a flower. The Nefesh Elokis is saying those properties that you know from science are actually a mashal, a way of understanding Elokus. Like, for example, the Rebbe uses the atom. The atom is very little kamus, almost minuscule, and has such tremendous energy. Okay, that's a scientific fact. How do you use it in Nefesh Elokis? That it teaches us that every person, no matter who you are, no matter how small you may be, and everything in existence has tremendously potent divine energy, tremendous opportunity, potential. So you can teach a person Avodas Hashem and use an atom as an example. So Nefesh Habamis can fully understand that. Because you're talking to the Seichel of the Nefesh Habamis, Seichel HaTivi Sheba Nefesh Habamis. So you see here how he's slowly developing that despite their opposite natures, but when you start understanding how they engage with each other, how the Seichel Nefesh Elikis is not a foreign language from the Nefesh Habamis if you do it properly. I mean, to be very frank, this is exactly what I tried to do. It's my whole work. All my work is doing this. It's trying to take a concepts from Torah, from Chassidus, spiritual concepts that on their own can be very abstract. Go talk about Eirei and Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, and putting it into a language with examples, whether psychological examples or emotional examples or scientific examples, or for that matter, political examples, examples of events that are happening in the world today. That's what we're doing. We're taking divine concepts and putting it into a language that Nefesh Habamis can relate to, and not only relate to, can be intrigued by and engaged and say, oh, wow. And it could even be Nefesh Habamis feels that it's in its own interest. You know, if you tell somebody, here's 5 steps of how to be a better communicator, or 5 steps of how to build a better relationship. So from the Nefesh Habamis point of view, not only is it interesting, it's going to serve my interest because I want a better relationship. So that's fine. That's perfectly fine. What the Nefesh Elikis is doing is speaking in the language, just like when you speak to a child, you can't just tell a child an abstract concept. So you give an example. An example from the world that the child relates to. You find something that's why I always say, whenever I go speak anywhere, I always ask the first thing, who's the target audience? I don't want to know about the topic is the topic, but everything is about the audience because you need to speak to them. And you have to put it into a language that relates. You speak to an audience that wants to hear a pilpul, a deep pilpul in the Gemara, it's one thing. Speak to an audience that doesn't even know what the word Gemara means, it has to be a completely different language. It could be the same ideas. But I'm just making this very practical because it is what he's saying here is essentially the process of how you can bring together really 2 different paradigms who are initially opposites. He said clearly, diametric opposites. And yet, because the Nefesh Habamis has seichel, so you have to engage it on the level that it can relate to. Okay.
That is the chiddush of the Alter Rebbe, that he took a godly seichel and put it in a human seichel.
Exactly. Mipsari echzel leka, for my flesh I behold God with many mishalim. That's Chabad, exactly. When you go to Kabbalah, in pure Kabbalah, there are sometimes examples, sometimes even scientific examples for the record, but primarily it's just spiritual concepts, very cryptic, mystical, esoteric ideas. You know, you hear like that Galgalta, the Atik, from there is Nimshech, the Chazei of Zoh of Arich. That's it, and it won't say anything more. So without explaining that this parallels different parts of the human being, you know, the super conscious and the conscious, etc., it's words. Those that know what it means will understand. Okay. I'm going to stop here because the parentheses is definitely obviously important, but it needs more explanation. So I'll stop before the parentheses. But any questions?
You could give even a simple, you said before about an Adam. People used to laugh at a person that is davening. What are you talking to the wall? But today, with technology, everyone knows you don't have to see it. Take laser, you're making surgeries. You don't see it, you don't touch it, and it's powerful. So that explains what a mitzvah is, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there are thousands. I mean, not thousands. There are literally infinite amount of examples. Anything that you explain where the Nefesh Habamis understands what you're saying is an example for this. The question is, which we'll address in the next class, does the Nefesh Alakis understand the Gashmis as much as the Nefesh Habamis understands the Ruchnis? In other words, when the Nefesh Alakis is using, let's say, an example from science or whatever, from Dvarim Tivim V'Chumrim, is it, how much does it relate to it? I think in the parentheses, he's going to address that a bit.
Yeah, I
Because
think
remember,
he's saying it in the parenthesis.
yeah.
מכל מקום, הרי הנפש האלוקית משיג את העניונים החומריים.
Ubehem v'ayoda masig ha'inyan alaki. Yeah, he's going to say it. I'm just laying the ground before we learn it. But we'll talk about it. Remember I gave a few days ago, I think, the example of the Rebbe's letter about a dry cleaners, the lesson from a dry cleaners. So we'll talk about that in tomorrow's class. But taking literally a physical thing and becomes, so when it becomes a total mashal for Elokus. When the Asad Lavi will say, Lo yeh kol ha'elam el ladasas Hashem bolvad, that the whole business of the world will to know God. Molad is deis Hashem kamayim le'yamechasim. That's part of it. B'chol derechecha da'ehu. In all your ways, which means mundane ways. Doesn't mean kedusha necessarily. Kol masecha yil Hashem shemayim. Kol derechecha da'ehu. In all your ways, everything that you see hashgacha pratis. Divine providence, divine wisdom. Remember, kulam b'chachma sir. Remember, there's a chachma embedded, shemen in everything. So essentially, when you take science and you explain it as explain a divine concept, you're extracting the shemen within the science and becoming fuel for the nefesh halikis. So now you're going to see how all this is going to come together as he continues. Just as a summary of what we're learning.
Rabbi, is it? I'm sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
Is it? Can one say that any good impulse and an impulse toward good behavior, toward selfless behavior, is coming? Is it originating from the nefesh elokis? So, for example, take
not necessarily. No.
Well, okay.
The end of chapter after chapter 1 in Tanya, he says that even the nefesh habamis of a klippus nega could be by shonim rachmanim gem lechasodim.
Yeah,
not
exactly.
necessarily nefesh elokis.
So if let's say an atheist walks down the street and he sees a poor person and he says who's asked who's begging for money, and he says I feel sorry for this person, it's sad that they have this bad lowly lot, and he gives him a tzedakah. So is that impulse coming from the nefesh bahamis or from the nefesh elokis?
Well, I have to challenge your premise that he's an atheist. He may say he's an atheist, maybe he's not. How do we don't find people as atheists. Atheists, from a Torah point of view, is just someone who doesn't know what God is.
Mm-hmm.
So they think So I wouldn't make an atheist a level in Avodah.
I understand, but I would try to find an example where someone doesn't think about godliness at all, and nevertheless,
I know many people who are my minim who give tzedakah because their nefesh habamis likes to give tzedakah.
That's my question.
Yeah, why not?
Not every good.
That's not what he's discussing. Yeah. First of all, he's talking about seichel. Midas he's going to talk about soon. That's number one. And secondly, the midas of nefesh habamis, like I said, in Tanya he says clearly, by shonim rachmanim, there's a personality type. Nefesh habamis could have a very kind personality. It doesn't say anywhere nefesh habamis is selfish or evil.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And kindness can be part of also self-interest and so on.
So then, what distinguishes a thought as being godly or not is whether or not God is part of the equation? Is it that explicit?
No, I wouldn't put it that way. Frankly, I would say, when you, like you said at length in the previous page, the seichel of nefesh habamis either is interested in self-interest. That's not godly. Self-interest is not godly. Self-interest is its own interest. Like he said, to acquire wealth,
yes,
to fame, honor, or protect itself, its reputation, to defend, and explain.
Those are easy cases, but what about?
But no, I'm just saying that's what he said. Then he
Right.
said that even abstract seichel like sciences is all about the yesh. That's what defines nefesh habamis as seichel. Nefesh halikis seichel, what defines it is it's interested in the ruchnius, in the ayin, not in understanding existence, or it's all self-interest, understanding. So it's not whether you use the word God. You could also study about God like a science. It's whether you're studying about yourself, you're understanding yourself and your needs, or understanding the world that you occupy, the yesh of this world, or are you going, like he said, ruach ha'adam eila maila, seeking a reality that's beyond yourself.
Understand. Thank you.
That's how he distinguished between seichel and nefesh halikis and nefesh habamis.
Thank you.
Now, you want to ask the question: what about people who are very transcendent in nature, and the tiny he says they don't have a nefesh halikis, a non-Jew? So what is that? Where is that coming from? And is it possible that a person's nefesh habamis is seeking something transcendent? You asked the question about philosophy. What about people who are simply, some people interested in physics, and some some nefesh habamis are interested in metaphysics. So that's something we could talk about. I don't want to talk about it right now. I'll address it in one of the coming classes, more detail.
Yeah, I was about to ask a question like that, so I'll hold it. But yeah, that's very curious.
It's not so, because firstly, the nefesh habamis is not completely, just like nefesh halikis can manifest nefesh habamis. Nefesh habamis can hypothetically also understand, like we say here, divine matters. And therefore, I could see it also gravitating. Some people are spiritual in nature, and they're seeking spirituality. But we'll talk about it more in detail, because there's a lot more to be said about it. This is discussed in a number of places.
Thank you.
I think the bottom line is if you remember that you're doing it because Hashem is telling you. The example with the atheist, if it's doing it because it's your nature, you cannot tolerate without it, it's not Hashem. But if you do it, sometimes the example is you give more than you want. You have mercy, but you give more because Hashem said. I think in one sentence.
That's one way to put it, but there's also more than that, because the fact of the matter is, there's some people who are just giving in nature, and that could be from the nefesh habamis. There's nothing wrong with saying that. It deserves more conversation. I agree, but we'll talk about it. I need to stop here. The second line on page 1465. So let's stop We'll discuss this further. I'm not forgetting what we said here, so don't think